The night was thick, and the only light came from the car's headlights and the faint glow of the moon that barely penetrated the surrounding trees. Ethan adjusted the rearview mirror with one hand, while the other gripped the steering wheel tightly. He was exhausted after an endless day of meetings and still had 2 more hours of driving before he could reach home. The silence in the car was broken only by the monotonous sound of the engine and the soft music playing on the radio. A melody that, in any other circumstance, would have been relaxing. He let out a heavy sigh. He shouldn't have taken the longer route. Avoiding tolls was a bad idea, he muttered to himself. The road was practically deserted, and the darkness made every shadow seem alive. Ethan glanced at the fuel gauge, checking that he still had enough gas, but he still felt a twinge of anxiety. It was the kind of road he hated, isolated, endless, and suffocating. As the minutes dragged on, he noticed lights appearing in the rearview mirror. 2 small, bright spots, distant but clearly moving. For a moment, he felt a slight relief. At least there was another car in this absolute solitude. Someone else as unlucky as me to be here at this hour, he thought with a wry smile. But the relief was short-lived. The headlights behind him began to slowly approach, keeping a constant distance, as if the driver were following his steps. Ethan slowed down, allowing the car to pass him. However, the headlights remained in the same position. He glanced again in the rearview mirror, feeling slightly uneasy. Maybe it was just coincidence, he thought. But there was something strange about the constancy of those headlights, as if they were synchronized with his movements. The radio began to fail, the music being replaced by soft static. Ethan frowned, trying to adjust the volume, but gave up when he realized that it only increased his irritation. The discomfort grew. He looked back at the road, but his attention remained fixed on the rearview mirror. The headlights were still there, motionless in their silent pursuit. The headlights behind Ethan remained steady, shining like 2 eyes that watched his every move. He tried to ignore them, focusing on the winding road ahead, but their constant presence was impossible to forget. The glare reflected in the rearview mirror seemed to grow stronger by the minute, as if it were moving closer on purpose. Ethan adjusted the mirror again, trying to alleviate the discomfort, but the headlights were still there, motionless at the same unsettling distance. He began to feel sweat dripping down his forehead, even with the air conditioning on. With a quick movement, Ethan changed lanes, expecting the car to pass him. But it didn't. The headlights followed him, changing lanes in sync. "What's wrong with this guy?" he muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Paranoia began to set in, but he tried to convince himself that it was just another distracted driver. The music on the radio, which had previously been just a soft melody, was now distorted into almost unrecognizable fragments. Static began to fill the speakers, and suddenly it seemed like the sound was coming from somewhere inside the car, like muffled whispers amidst the noise. Ethan turned off the radio with a sharp click, but the silence that followed seemed even more oppressive. The only sound now was the roar of the engine and the soft squeak of the tires on the asphalt. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror again, this time more closely. Something seemed wrong. The headlights didn't flicker, didn't waver, even on the tightest curves. It was as if they were fixed, unchanging. He strained his eyes, trying to see the car that was emitting them, but the darkness around him made it impossible to make out any detail beyond the blinding lights. He accelerated, trying to create some distance between himself and the vehicle. The car's speed rose quickly, the speedometer reading over 70 miles per hour. Still, the headlights remained, tracking him with frightening precision. Panic began to set in. "This doesn't make sense," he thought, trying to rationalize the situation. When he glanced back in the rearview mirror, he thought he saw something beyond the lights. A vague figure sitting in the driver's seat of the car behind him. Ethan's heart raced. He quickly looked away, fixing his gaze on the road. "I'm just tired," he whispered to himself, trying to control his breathing. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The tension in the air was palpable. Ethan kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, his fingers almost digging into the leather surface. The road seemed to stretch on forever ahead, shrouded in shadows that his car's headlights could barely penetrate. But it wasn't the darkness of the road that terrified him. It was the steady glow of the headlights behind him, which seemed as fixed as the stars in the sky. He slowed down, deciding to test whether the other vehicle was really following him, or if it was all just his imagination. As his car slowed to a near stop, the headlights behind him slowed too, maintaining the same uncomfortable distance. Ethan's stomach churned. This was no coincidence. Something was happening. He suddenly accelerated, pushing the speedometer to 90 miles per hour, the engine roaring in protest. The trees around him blurred, and the curves of the road forced him to grip the steering wheel more tightly. For a moment, he thought he might just make it past them. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, there they were. The headlights hadn't moved, hadn't dimmed or gotten any closer. They remained like a relentless predator. Ethan felt sweat trickling down the back of his neck. The radio, which he had turned off earlier, began to emit a low, distorted sound again. It was a mix of static and something else. Whispers, barely audible. He turned up the volume, trying to identify what it was. But the sound intensified, invading the car like a wave of murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. The discomfort gave way to panic when, adjusting the rearview mirror again, Ethan saw something different. There was a figure in the car behind him, now clearly visible. It wasn't just the driver. It was something wrong, something impossible to describe. The face seemed to be smiling, but the smile was grotesque, stretched unnaturally, as if the skin itself were being forced to support that expression. He quickly looked away, focusing on the road. "This isn't happening," he whispered to himself, but his voice was shaking as much as his hands. The trees around him began to look the same, as if he were driving in circles. With each turn, the scenery didn't change, and the certainty that something was very wrong began to solidify. Ethan's panic grew as he realized there was no way out of this chase. He accelerated again, screaming to himself, "Let it go! Let it go!" But the headlights wouldn't let him. They never would. The tension in Ethan's chest was unbearable, each breath becoming shorter and sweat dripping from his temples. The road ahead seemed like an endless trail, but then he spotted something that might offer relief. A rest area, its dim lights flashing like a beacon of hope. Without hesitation, he turned the steering wheel sharply, feeling the tires squeal against the asphalt. He parked in a dark corner, turned off the headlights, and turned off the engine, letting the silence take over. The headlights of the car behind him soon appeared at the entrance to the rest area. Ethan watched with his heart racing as the vehicle slowed and stopped a few feet away, its bright lights illuminating everything around it, including the interior of Ethan's car. He waited, motionless, trying to calm his breathing. With each passing second, the dread grew. He had to find out who or what was following him. Gathering courage, Ethan opened the trunk of his own car and grabbed a wrench. It was a makeshift weapon, but better than facing the unknown empty-handed. He got out of the car slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the vehicle parked in front of him. The air seemed cooler now, the wind whistling softly through the trees. As he approached the car, the silence was almost deafening. There was no engine sound, no footsteps, no voices. Only the faint hum of streetlights. Ethan reached the driver's door of the vehicle and stopped. He swallowed hard, reaching for the door. It gave way easily, but what he saw inside made the ground seem to disappear beneath his feet. The interior of the car was empty. There was no driver, no passengers, just an unsettling emptiness. The steering wheel, seats, and dashboard were covered in a thin layer of dust, as if the car had been sitting there for years. The headlights remained on, blinding his vision as he tried to make sense of what was happening. A sound behind him made him freeze. It was soft, almost like the snap of a twig being stepped on. Ethan turned quickly, his wrench raised in defense, but there was no one there. Suddenly, his own car flashed its headlights, once, twice, illuminating his frightened figure. He ran back, but the doors were locked, refusing to open even with the key. The sound of footsteps began to echo again, coming from all directions. Ethan looked around, but the darkness was impenetrable. The headlights of the empty car behind him flashed one last time, before going out completely, plunging the rest area into eerie silence and darkness. The darkness around him was suffocating, and Ethan felt its weight on his shoulders as if it were physical. He tried to open the car doors again, but none of them would budge. He tapped on the windows with the wrench, but the sound echoed dully, as if he were trapped in a bubble. The headlights of the empty car were still off, but he could feel a presence, something that was not human, watching him from somewhere. His heart seemed to explode in his chest when he realized that the silence had been replaced by a low, steady sound. Footsteps. They were not hurried, but deliberate, as if something was approaching carefully, savoring its prey. He turned in every direction, trying to locate the source, but it was useless. The sound came from all sides, surrounding him. With desperation dominating his senses, Ethan made the only decision that seemed viable: run. He dashed down the road, leaving his car and the rest area behind. The asphalt seemed endless beneath his feet, but he didn't dare stop. The sound of footsteps followed him, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but never completely fading. He glanced back only once and saw something that nearly made him stumble. The headlights had come on again, but they weren't still. They were following him, moving like floating eyes in the darkness. Ethan ran until his legs burned, the air rushing in and out of his lungs in fits and starts. He fell to his knees in the middle of the road, exhausted, unable to go on. When he looked up, the headlights were right in front of him, illuminating him with an almost blinding intensity. The brightness seemed to penetrate his skin, exposing something deep and indescribable inside him. He heard a sound that sounded like laughter, low and guttural, and then the headlights slowly moved closer until they were completely engulfing him. The light consumed him, and all that was left was absolute silence. And if you've made it this far, prove you're not afraid of the unknown. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And remember, on the next turn, terror might be waiting for you. Welcome to Asphalt Horror.